I had my bell. All right, I'm going to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Beaumont, the 72nd club founded in the world. Today, our invocation is going to be brought to us by Rebecca Maxwell, Director of the Scholarships Office at Lamar University, and the pledges, Jennifer Gregory, Human Resources Officer, Beaumont Housing Authority. Rebecca?
If you would bow your heads with me, or I invite you to observe a moment of silence where you're at. I would like to take a moment today for us all to remember and say a special prayer for those who may be in the path of Hurricane Delta. As Southeast Texans, we know the challenges those individuals may face this week and in the aftermath of such a large storm. And if possible, I would pray that that storm is just diminished as much as possible over the next few days. I also pray for a special blessing over those in the meeting today and for Rotarians all around the world. We are all committed to doing real service work to help humankind. And I pray that we all just remember that in our daily lives throughout the many frustrations we've all had this year and challenges we've faced. We are blessed to be able to still give back in some kind of way. And I'm thankful for that opportunity through Rotary. Many of us live our daily routines and come to know how much joy that we have in caring for others and sharing our fortune or our fortunate situation with others in our community and around the world. So I just pray that we all remember that as we go through the rest of the next couple of months, and we all hope for a wonderful year of 2021. Amen.
Amen.
If everybody could join me with the pledge to the United States and Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge
allegiance to Texas, one state under God, one indivisible.
Thank you, Rebecca and Jennifer. One way that you can help us out right now is to get in touch with Mandy and sign up to do the invocation or the pledge. That would be very helpful. So give Mandy a call and sign up for one of the future meetings to lead one of those two opportunities that we have right now. Cheryl Billieu has a special guest today, and she'd like to take a little bit of time to introduce him.
Hello. Hi, Scott. My guest today is Scott Mills. He has deep roots in both Oklahoma, where he was born, and in the Big Thicket region of Southeast Texas, where his mother's ancestors settled as early as the 1850s. They helped to establish churches and cemeteries at Menard Chapel and the Big Sandy Camp Ruby communities in Polk County. His great-grandparents raised 11 children, all surviving the Spanish flu epidemic. Scott and his sister still own his great-grandparents' farmland east of Camp Ruby on the Big Sandy Creek. Scott and I are fellow classmates from Nathan Hale High School in Tulsa, Oklahoma, graduated in 1979. We are also fellow Sooners from the University of Oklahoma. In high school, he was elected class president all 3 years, and while attending OU, he was elected city council member for Norman, Oklahoma. Scott's Rotary background is very extensive, and this is just to include a few items. He was Rotary Youth Exchange student to England, third-generation Rotarian, helped to charter 2 clubs. He was Rotarian of the Year. He served as the assistant governor. He was Paul Harris Society Chair, Paul Harris Fellow, Level 3 Major Donor, and a member of the Bequest Society. That's just a handful. Scott is an employment law attorney, and he and his wife Kim and their 2 teenagers now reside in Prince William County, Virginia, southwest of DC. Please welcome my very dear friend and long-term friend, Scott Mills.
Welcome, Rotarian Scott Mills. We're so glad that you're joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, I want to introduce Lynn Hill. She is going to talk about some club business and the Rotary course.
Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. We're asking for all of our friends who have a beautiful shower quality singing voice, if you would please join us for the Christmas Rotary course. Our Rotary course will once again be virtual. If some of you were able to see that when we installed our own Becky Mason for district governor, we had the virtual Rotary course and it was a beautiful selection. I learned that Dr. Hahn was a magician and he indeed worked his magic to make that as beautiful and as pleasant as it was. So he again is going to practice a little magic, and this time it's going to be Christmas magic to help us with our Christmas Rotary course. So as we all know, the holidays are a busy time, so we're asking that everyone please go ahead and sign up so that we may start working on this as quickly as possible. If you would like to sign up, you may contact me via cell 781-3291 or email lynnhillbd@gmail.com, both of which contact information is in the Club Runner. And also Jackie will put up the sign up genius for anyone to sign up. So we're encouraging all to sign up so that we can have another magical, beautiful virtual Rotary course for our Christmas party.
Lynn, also family members can sing too, can't they?
Yes, yes. And if your voice sounds better in the shower, since it's virtual, in the shower, sing. Just keep your clothes on and we'll just have to do that.
Okay, so if you have a beautiful singing voice, and even I know if it's not so beautiful, that Dr. Hahn even made that sound excellent. So get with Lynn and talk to your family members, and let's have a big Rotary course available for our holiday party. Now to introduce our guest speaker, I have Joanne Brown, Major Gifts Officer at Lamar University. Joanne? I saw her earlier.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all Rotarians, family members, and guests. I would like to take this moment to recognize and thank Becky Mason, our current Rotary District 5910 governor.
Hey, I'm over here. I just didn't want to scare you. That's okay. No, I'm just listening to my Zoom call.
And former president of Rotary Club of Beaumont, our centennial year, 2012-2013.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I don't think they can hear me.
Who is that? There are very few opportunities each of us are given to introduce a real hometown hero. Today is one of those opportunities for me and the speaker's family members who are here joining us today. Ellen Renstra, sister of the speaker, and Kenneth Linsley, son of our speaker. Thank you very much for being with us today. Our speaker is a sixth generation Jefferson County resident. She is the director of the Center for History and Culture of Southeast Texas and the Upper Gulf Coast at Lamar University, where she received her BA and MA degrees. And she is a curator of interpretation and education at the Mamie McFadden Ward Museum in Beaumont, where she has been present for 31 years and 11 months, researching and programming for the Historic House Museum. Our speaker has co-authored 3 books: Beaumont, A Chronicle of Promise in 1982, the McFadden Ward House in 1992, and the prize-winning Giant Under the Hill, A History of the Spindletop Oil Discovery in Beaumont in 1901, which was published by the Texas State Historical Association in 2002. She is also formerly contributor to the History Journal column of the Beaumont Journal, and the Jefferson County Chronicles. There are many articles that this lady has written, including coverage of when Beaumonters received the city park. That was a generous gift from Captain W.C. Terrell in 1920. Terrell Park was donated with 500 acres of land to the city. There is coverage that she has been responsible for World War II in Beaumont. Many Beaumont families sent more than one member into service. Beaumonters lived with rationing of meat, sugar, leather, rubber, gasoline, and limited supplies of other things. This lady covered the wedding that was beyond description, over the top, in 1901 when Gladys Bingham and Bain Price married. If you remember, Spindletop promoter Patillo Higgins named the Gladys City Oil and Gas Company for Gladys Bingham, his Sunday school student. Then an article covering in the late 1920s the prohibition of enforcement problems here in Beaumont during the Roaring 20s, and many of its term and icons: bootleg booze, moonshiners, speakeasies, Al Capone, Elliot Ness and his untouchables, where prohibition was unenforceable. Last but not least, I mentioned that Beaumont had an ice skating rink, and this lady wrote a beautiful coverage of Carol Ward's gift to the city of Beaumont from the Beaumont, Texas Ice Company, where a skating rink was created on the corner of Natchez and Franklin Streets. Her colleagues were asked to share her many skills using just one or two words. And here are their words: customer service, higher education, historic preservation, public relations, African American history, 19th and early 20th Texas history, military history, American history, community outreach, museum collections, museum education, research, archives and archival research, nonprofits, press releases, public speaking, fundraising, event planning, photography, grant writing, newsletters, and this last one, Past Perfect, the world's leading collection of management software. The class from 1964 from French High School treasures their relationship with this lady and the lunches that they have where she connects long lost classmates when they come back to town. A gentle way for each of us to hug our loved ones, particularly during this COVID pandemic, is to learn our history. Today's speaker allows us to do just that. With gratitude, please help me welcome a treasure in our own midst, the October 7th Rotary Club of Beaumont speaker, Judith Walker Lindsay.
Now, can you hear me now? Almost forgot to mute myself. Am I coming through okay, Jackie?
Yes, yes, you are.
Hello? Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure, since it's telling me it's unstable off and on. So I apologize if I get kicked off. It has been reconnecting me pretty quickly. Well, thank you very much for that, Joanne. And goodness. Would love to be able to really live up to all of that, but I appreciate it. And thank you all for having me today. Let me find it.
Judy, I don't know if everyone else is hearing what I'm hearing, but you're cutting out. Maybe we need to. I don't know what to
You
suggest.
might try disconnecting and reconnecting.
I've heard sometimes when there's problems like this, that if everybody turns off their picture, stop video, so you can hear her, that it might be less drain on it. I'm not an expert though.
It also might help if she turns off her video.
Yeah, y'all check the messages. There's one from Van Greer with a suggestion.
I had another suggestion that maybe Ted Moore should log off. Don't know if that's going to help or not, but.
I believe she has logged off, and we'll watch and see if she comes back on.
Who was that guy?
I'm
How
on
did he get on
again.
this?
I'm on again, but it may not want me to do my PowerPoint. Is that the problem?
Hearing you pretty well right now. Did you see that suggestion that maybe if you called in the number? Let's try it, Judy. Go ahead and try.
And it does help if everyone will turn off their video.
Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's try again.
It looks like everybody's off.
I'm on the slideshow. No, I'm not. Just a minute. Now, can you hear me? Hello?
It's a little bit broken, but let's go ahead and try.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. Oh. All right. Pandemics and other epidemics, pandemics, you have smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, influenza, polio, and coronavirus now. People my age particularly remember the polio.
Judy, I know this is frustrating for you. Is there another spot in the museum where you could take that laptop?
Jackie, or maybe if she called in on her phone.
Struck rich and poor randomly, and when the Salk vaccine became available,
Judy, can you hear me? Joanne, if you can hear me, would you call Judy on her cell phone and tell her this is just not working? If there's another spot in the museum she can go to and try to log in again?
I'll be happy to.
Joanne? Hey, I'm already moved to another room. I'll see. I don't know whether it's gonna help or not. I'm echoing because you're hearing me on Zoom too. Okay, all right, bye.
Judy, we do see you well now.
Oh, well, that's good. I can't see you all right now. Just a minute. Oh, shoot. Hang on.
Well, everybody shut off their cameras just about to help with the bandwidth problem. We did better yesterday at your home, didn't we?
Yeah, I should have stayed home. Now I'm in another room. We'll see if that works. Oh, hang on just a minute. Gotta go get my script.
Thank you all for your patience. I know this is frustrating for her. We did try yesterday and it worked beautifully, so unexpected.
Now, I apologize, everyone. It never fails when you try to make things better. It just makes them worse. All right, shall I try my PowerPoint again?
Let's do. If it not, we'll just forego that.
Yeah, it's not essential. Well, oh, here it goes. No, there it goes. Let's see, show. Now, okay, well, I had spoken for us in the United States and all the work Rotary's done internationally. But we'll go back to 1918, the pandemic that we're actually talking about, and I'll recite you a poem that came out about that time. It's called, well, I don't know what it's named, but it starts off, it says, I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened up the window and in flew Enza. So that came out in 1918, and that was a little children's chant. But of course, the origin of it is a very deadly disease, and supposedly it's like the children's game of Ring Around the Rosie that refers to the Black Death, although I have read lately that that's not really a reference to that. It just fits real well. Anyway, the 1918 influenza officially lasted from February 1918 to April 1920. It infected 500 million people, and that was about a third of the world's population at the time, in 3 or 4 successive waves, depending on who's counting. The number of deaths worldwide was estimated conservatively to be between 50 million and 100 million. Adjusted for population, that would equal 220 million to 430 million people today. So you had about 675,000 deaths. That would be equal to 1.4 million in today's population. More people died of influenza during the 1918 pandemic than a total number of military and civilian deaths that resulted from World War I hostilities. So compare that with 2020. Now remember, this pandemic isn't over yet, but current totals, cases worldwide are 35 million people with about 1,047,000 deaths. US cases are about 7.5 million, deaths 210 and counting. Jefferson County has over 7,600 confirmed cases with 137 deaths. Viral pandemics, of course, happen when a new viral strain develops in an animal and at some point jumps to humans who don't have any immunity to it. The 1918 influenza pandemic was caused by an H1N1 virus, influenza. Now, this pandemic is a coronavirus, so they're not the same type virus, but in a lot of cases they were. This is the same virus that caused the SARS and MERS epidemics in the earlier part of this century. Okay, well, where did it originate? In 1918. How did it spread? The most widely accepted theory is that it began in the United States. In January 1918 in Kansas, an agricultural community that was very, very heavy in livestock, cattle, swine, chickens, other poultry. Haskell County boys who were going to train for the military during World War I were sent for basic training to Camp Funston, 300 miles away. And Camp Funston was part of what is now Fort Riley. And I think that it was Fort Riley then too. Haskell County News in January of 1980, they flew with him. So over the next 2 years, wartime transportation of troops and supplies spread this influenza worldwide. You can imagine troops, ships and troop trains just jammed with soldiers. And then the soldiers came back and brought it back with them to spread them again in their hometowns. And this probably strengthened the erroneous belief, probably erroneous belief that it started in Europe to begin with. And so influenza just raged through military posts and cities, especially urban cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They were port cities. They were also had military posts nearby. Now, one reason for the big discrepancy in the world count, I mean, there's a difference between 50 million people and 100 million people dead, was the lack of accurate reporting, especially from really, really remote places, and especially if there really wasn't anyone left to tell a tale. This was quite literally a worldwide pandemic. For example, in the fall of 1918, during the most deadly wave of the pandemic, influenza struck a small Alaskan village called Brevig Mission, which had about 80 adult inhabitants, mostly indigenous people. During the 5-day period from November 15th through the 20th, the pandemic claimed the lives of 72 of those 80 adults, basically leaving just children. This scenario was repeated all over the world, and here are the some of the children from this Brevig mission. It's worth mentioning here, by the way, about the incubation period. COVID-19 has, as we know, a relatively long incubation period, so that surges usually begin up to 2 weeks after a big exposure. And people can infect other people before they have symptoms that they know of. Well, influenza, or this influenza, was very different. The incubation period is very short, just a few days, less than half of COVID. And so in 1918, this influenza, this particularly deadly version, would quite literally burn through a community in 6 to 10 weeks, and then it was gone. It had, you know, someone had probably taken it somewhere else with them, but they would burn themselves, the influenza virus would burn itself out. So in who were the most vulnerable? Well, in 1918, roughly half the victims who died were in the prime of life, in their 20s and 40s. Traditional influenza was especially hard on the very young and the very old, creating a U-shaped mortality profile. But this flu created a W-shaped, and you can see the two different ones. There was a pandemic or an epidemic in 1911, and that was just traditional. Some of it was just what they call endemic, the kinds you have every year. And you see that the very young and the very old had the highest mortality rates. But in the interim, in the 1918 flu, which is the solid line, the very, very young fall victim, then children to adolescents to young adults are okay. And then from the age of 25 into say 34 had the very highest rate. and then it goes down again until you get to be very old. And the symptoms of this flu were sometimes very alarming. Some of the flu cases were just traditional, you know, fever, headaches, body aches, GI symptoms, but a frighteningly large number of the 1918 patients collapsed without warning. I mean, they could literally drop in their tracks. Their skin would darken from lack of oxygen because their lungs were filling up with fluid. They hemorrhaged from ears, nose, and mouth, and they literally died within hours of their first symptoms. Others held on a few days and then died of pneumonia. The sudden violent deaths are called cytokine responses, and you may have heard that in connection with some cases in COVID, not nearly so many, but it's where a person's immune system overreacts, and that's why the young and healthy had this happen, because they were young and healthy and their immune systems overreacted. This was much more frequent in 1918 and very frightening. So what kind of treatment did they have in 1918? Well, of course, you know now some unproven treatments have come up and you know, made an appearance, and then they'll be debunked or discredited. And the same was true in 1918, but there was a whole lot less control of it then. There was a lot less medical science to offset it. In 1918, of course, there were no antibiotics for the secondary pneumonia, et cetera. There were no ventilators, no steroids. The ventilators actually came not too long after this. No steroids, whatever, just really no treatment except they could try to prevent it. They could isolate, they could quarantine, limit public gatherings, urge people to wear masks, which they did, push for good hygiene and disinfectants. Generally, health officials would prescribe bed rest, good food, sometimes salts of quinine, which was a malaria treatment, and aspirin. Some got really creative. One said, wash the inside of the nose with soap and water each night and morning, which wouldn't be very much fun. Force yourself to sneeze night and morning, then breathe deeply. Do not wear a muffler. Take sharp walks regularly and walk home from work, and eat plenty of porridge. And so, you know, all of that is very nice, but nothing particularly constructive. Newspaper ads, of course, were full of products, from purgatives to nose spray, and especially Vicks VapoRub. And that was the Vicks VapoRub company that was really pushing for it. Okay, well, in the midst of the pandemic, and even at the very worst, you still had a lot of wry humor, what we call gallows humor. And on the left, you have a political cartoon, and there's the influenza of whatever he's supposed to be. And the poor patient is saying, ask him how long he's going to stay, will you, doc? And it says, my internet connection's unstable. We'll have to see what happens. On the right is a picture that I'm assuming it was sent to me by a friend of mine who's from Italy. And I'm assuming it's an Italian family, but I have seen it on the internet other places. And it says a photo of the family during 1920. So this is a little after the worst of the pandemic, but it refers to the Spanish flu. And he says, note the cat. And if you'll look, the cat is wearing a mask. And if someone will tell me how they got that cat to peacefully wear that mask, I'd like to know. I will use something like that on my cat. Next time I need to do something, whether she doesn't want me to. Okay, so how long did the pandemic last in 1918? Well, there were at least 3 waves of illnesses. I mentioned 3 to 4. They got, after the worst one, they got progressively milder, but they started in March 1918. The first one was relatively mild itself and mostly ignored. A lot weren't even sure it was influenza. And if you look at this picture, the Grim Reaper, he's got influenza on his scythe, but there's a question mark after it. It's called the passing enemy. And I think at that point, maybe they had not quite decided. But that was the one in early 1918. Even though it killed a lot of people at Camp Funston in Kansas and where it went, it was still not considered the horrible pandemic that it was later. The second wave in the fall of 1918 was the most lethal, and it was responsible for most of the deaths in the United States, at least. A third milder wave occurred excuse me, during the winter and spring of 1919, winter of 1918, late 1918 and spring of 1919. Some records, as I say, mentioned a fourth wave, and that ended in early 1920. And of course, we're being warned of a possible second wave, possible or probable, depending on who you consult. In 1918, the response to the pandemic, both national and local, tended to be denial because we were fighting a world war. And everybody, if you ever read any local or national newspapers in 1918, that's all that's in almost, you know, any newspaper. The majority of the articles will involve the war effort or the home front effort or something to do with the war. One author said it's as if we could, as a society, only contain one big idea at a time, and the big idea was the war. The leaders failed to recognize and deal with the extent of the threat and were not willing to distract from the war effort. They said, you're reassuring things like this is an ordinary influenza by another name. This is not an epidemic, even when you had cases, even when Philadelphia, for instance, was digging mass graves, closed schools, saloons, theaters, and banned public gatherings. One newspaper continued to insist there is no cause for alarm. But people knew what they were seeing, and death estimates among industrial workers in particular was 3.25% in a very short time of weeks. Remember, took the influenza 6 to 10 weeks to burn through a community. So people began to stay home. You had a lot of absenteeism in the workforce. During the worst times, there was something like a 40 to 60% rate of absenteeism. And this included, for instance, the industrial places that were doing things, you know, building military equipment, et cetera, for the war effort. This is actually a ship, a wooden hull ship that was being built in Beaumont during the World War I. It was a government, they built a government shipyard, which then went on to be Bethlehem, or Pennsylvania shipyards, I'm sorry. And the newspaper was very concerned about the rate of absenteeism in the shipyard because they just weren't showing up for work. Now, even the name Spanish flu came from denial because during World War I, the US and most European countries involved in the war suppressed the press coverage of the flu. Weren't calling it flu, weren't calling it anything bad, weren't calling it an epidemic. They denied either the existence or the severity, even in the worst of it. But Spain was neutral in World War I. So they weren't involved in the fighting, and so they had a free and reliable press that could report the Spanish flu and how much they were dealing with it and where it was. And actually the Spanish king came down with it. So their accurate reporting made people in other countries who weren't hearing anything about it from their country think it originated there. So they called it the Spanish influenza. So it got, Spain got a bad rep for that. The timeline of the 1918 pandemic in Beaumont, I just want to kind of cover that right quick so you can see how it did end up going through fairly quickly. I don't know when this parade exactly was, other than the caption says late 1918. That's Pearl Street. The people are standing right where the trains come through this open space. So that's where Crockett Street is now. And so they're marching northward on Pearl Street. And you see all of the military men and you see the crowds gathered around. So if this was any time in late September, you would call that a super spreader event, I'm sure. But I don't know exactly. I just know there were numerous parades, patriotic parades, and crowds and sales of Liberty loans and things like that. So there were many places where people crowded up. So Beaumont was really hit by the second deadly wave. And while it hit very quickly and hard, it doesn't appear to have been quite as deadly here as it was in Philadelphia or Boston. On the other hand, I can't swear as to the accuracy of the figures. Beaumont was also dealing at the same time with a very quote unquote malignant form of smallpox in town. And that seems to have been of even more concern to leaders, probably because they already knew how deadly smallpox was and they could actually do something about it. They could vaccinate people against it. So they were in the midst of a really heavy vaccination campaign for smallpox. But in any case, the local newspaper focused more on the war effort than on the influenza. Just everything, war news, draft lists, Red Cross work, war saving stamps drives, letters from soldiers, and of course the impending end of the war, because this is going to be October and you have the end of the war on November 11th. So the first day, the day before this, on October 3rd, the newspaper reported a couple of bad cases of grip. That's their shortened form of la grippe. Okay, on October 4th, which is the next day, it reported 250 cases of influenza. And by October 8th, the newspaper reported thousands as being ill, including 1,200 school kids. So you see what I mean by how fast it would burn through a community. That same day, October 8th, Beaumont recorded its first influenza death, and the mayor closed all public places, schools, churches, pool halls, and prohibited all public gatherings. The soldiers guarding the refinery and shipyards had already been quarantined. The local health officer said the situation is serious. Immediate action is necessary, although at least one local doctor continued to insist it was just ordinary flu. After October 8th, the newspaper reported that the shortage of doctors and nurses made an accurate running case count impossible. Either that or they didn't want to frighten the public again. The local Red Cross was enlisted to make gauze masks, and they held crash courses in practical nursing for flu patients. In other words, calling for anyone who had any nursing experience or wanted to learn how to be a nurse in just a few days so that they could actually send them to homes. Remember, this is the days when you still have house calls. And the only time people went to the hospital back then was basically when they were about to die. Or if there was surgery needed, but not for an illness, because what they got at the hospital was really not much different. The people were asked not to call for a nurse to come to their house unless the situation was dire. So, you know, you were kind of, you couldn't go to a hospital, and you really couldn't call a nurse unless things were just beyond saving for the most part. The sick were advised to go to bed, get plenty of rest, apply a cold application, which is just a cold cloth on your forehead, and take aspirin and a purgative. By the way, the Red Cross was already really, really busy beyond capacity, rolling bandages, knitting for soldiers, and sewing for Belgian orphans. And the Red Cross here in Beaumont had just received orders from the national office to make 1,500 gauze masks. That's in addition to the ones they were making in Beaumont for the people who needed to become nurses overnight. So on October 10th, the local health board ordered that the shutdown continue until both the flu and the smallpox are so in hand that they are not likely to spread. Now, they went on to say this does not mean that the city has an epidemic of either malady. On October 16th, the newspaper estimated 5,000 active cases, 2,000 recoveries, and only 9 deaths. And in quotes, it says a remarkably light toll. And if that's accurate, it is indeed. By then, supplies of quinine and aspirin were nearly exhausted. And on October 21st, and quinine and aspirin were the two cures that were actually, the two medications that were actually given. On October 21st, an Enterprise editorial admitted that too many people had treated the influenza lightly, but that it, quote, is a serious thing and we shall rejoice when it goes its way, unquote. It was a hard-learned lesson. Later in October, true to influenza's rapid burn through, Beaumont's daily numbers began dropping. And on November 3rd, the quarantine was lifted, though the public was warned to continue being careful. Beaumont was able to celebrate Armistice Day on November 11th with wild parades, and it is good thing that they were able to, because that didn't cause any more cases. It really was over by then, because literally before dawn, the people, they blew the mill whistles at the time the armistice was signed in Europe, which was early morning here. And so people came out before daylight in their night clothes and just ran up and down Pearl Street and danced and sang and hugged and screamed and yelled. And that kept on all day long and into the night. And so fortunately, the epidemic in Beaumont was over by then. The final estimate was 20,000 cases, and that's in a population of 40,000. So you had about a 50% infection rate, but only 75 fatalities. And I don't know, I've not made a count. I do know, I don't know where that includes people who died later of pneumonia. And my far from exhaustive examination of newspaper obits during this time indicates that almost all the fatalities from pneumonia or from pneumonia due to influenza, depending on how they worded it, were people between 20 and 40. I saw very few older people and very few infants. But it made Beaumont's stats run true to that W profile that we established elsewhere. Okay, long-term effects. Lingering depression among survivors, and that's true. That's true of any influenza case, but after this pandemic, that it really affected a lot of people. There was the life expectancy in the United States, because of the number of deaths, was lowered by 12 years. And of course, the misinformation led to a long-term erosion of public. Typically, Woodrow Wilson was in Paris working on the Treaty of Versailles, and he contracted what most people thought was probably the influenza. He was very ill for a short time, and afterwards people said he was changed, that he just had kind of lost his energy and his drive. And you know, he had such hopes for that treaty, and he came home, he submitted the treaty to the Senate. They said his personality had changed, he had become more intractable, and so he refused to compromise, and the Senate rejected the treaty. It was not ever signed, and the treaty as finished was so punitive to defeated powers that it was said to have been a major cause of World War II. And I should amend that to say the United States never signed it. The European powers did. But it was so harsh that it is said to have been a major contributor of World War II. There is one interesting sidebar I found in one of the books I read, life insurance payouts. There was a German immigrant who had come to America in the 1800s. He had done very well. He died of influenza in 1918. His widow and son invested his life insurance money and made a fortune. The immigrant who died was Donald Trump's grandfather. So that was an interesting sidebar, I thought. What was learned? Well, in the early 20th century, leaders in American medical science transformed the American medical system from one of the most backward in the world into the best in the world. This was before the pandemic. But these pioneers led the forces who were working to try to find a vaccine, a cure, how it was happening, you know, everything they could about it. And their work during the pandemic actually became the way medical research was done in the future. The training, the procedures, the protocols, and growth of the great big labs like Johns Hopkins, Rockefeller Institute, Harvard, places like that who are really always cutting edge in these things. Now, there was no flu vaccine found in the 1918 epidemic, but work on it continued until it finally came in the 1940s. They began to develop flu vaccines. And in 2005, the genome of the 1918 virus was recreated using samples taken from 1918 flu victim tissue, some from labs that had been saved, some from victims in that Brevet Mission village because they were buried in the permafrost. In 2020, of course, we're still learning. We already have improved treatment and testing. We also have, of course, a lot better facilities to treat people in the hospitals. We're hopefully very near a vaccine. So maybe research will also lead to better methods of containing or even preventing future pandemics. A vital part of the goal of this, of what we learned here, will be to remind the world that pandemics can happen and do happen, and we need to be ready for them. Thank you for having me, and I'm so sorry the connection was bad, but I hope it worked out all right ultimately.
Thank you so much, Judy, for joining us today. We have time for just a couple of questions if anyone would like to ask one.
Oh, okay. Oh, scared myself.
What were the statistics again about how many people caught the Spanish flu and how many died?
Could you hear that, Judy? I know I wrote down in Beaumont, Ted, that she said that we had 40,000 people that lived here, 20,000 people contacted it, and 75 fatalities. But that was for Beaumont. Do you have those statistics, Judy, for
the worldwide? Worldwide, it infected 500 million people. It was about a third of the world's population at that time. Now, the death toll was anywhere between 50 and 100 million. And that's a more recent estimate, like probably up till 20 years ago, till they started kind of researching it again. They thought more like maybe 20 million or 30 million, but it came to pass that there were all these tiny communities all over the world. I mean, in most remote Africa and in this Inuit village in Alaska, that had been completely wiped out and weren't really included in the statistics. So they realized they had vastly underestimated it.
Judy,
now,
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Judy, this is Regina.
Yeah.
How are you? Wonderful,
Hey.
Wonderful presentation. I just wanted to tell you that unfortunately, my grandfather was one of the fatalities. He died in January of 1921 in Chicago, and he was 29 years old and left 6 children. And he was one of the ones who was not ill and just collapsed that you referred to.
Right, the cytokine response. Yeah, that was a really frightening thing, was how quickly people died.
At such a young age and such a healthy man.
Thank you
What they
for
were saying
sharing.
is that a whole generation was lost. I'm sorry, what?
I was just thanking Regina for sharing that information, because it brings it home when you connect it to people that you know and that have been affected by it.
Well, I never really knew about it. All I knew was that he died during the flu epidemic in Chicago. I didn't even know it was the Spanish flu. My father was 9 at the time, 6 children ranging down to 6 months. And there was never any real discussion. And 3 children had to be put in orphanages because there was no, they were just very poor. But now I know it was the Spanish flu. And of course, none of my family is here to be able to describe what happened. But my father was only 9 and he was the oldest. So it does bring it home. And when we say, that we've lost over 200,000 people in this country, unless it hits us personally, we don't really understand the depth of it. But of course, we know a number of people who've reached out to us at Gift of Life, et cetera, who have had families who, family members who have died. So very tragic. And of course, the most difficult part is for people who have no they don't have insurance and they don't have the means to fight infection or get regular doctor's appointments. So we're working really hard on that. And hope, and I don't mean this as a political statement, but hope that Texas will reverse its stance and allow for Medicaid expansion, because that will enable another 1.5 million people to get on the insurance rolls. Okay, I'm off now. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you
so much.
That makes such a difference to share that.
Miss Judy,
Yes.
my name is and my friend from Virginia, actually went to high school together and college together. He's joining us today, Scott Mills. And the introduction, I don't know if you were able to hear it, but his great grandparents were in the Big Thicket region, and that's where they settled, and they raised 11 children. The entire family survived that flu epidemic. So that just how lucky was his family.
Yes, it was. It was. I'm the president now of a family cemetery association. It's the Hook Cemetery between Beaumont and Kuntz. And there are a number of unmarked graves in there. They're only marked by, it's disappearing now, I need to redo it, but they were marked by somebody just stuck a rebar in the ground and then put a form around it and poured concrete in it. And it was said that that was my great uncle who did that, and that those were victims of the 1918 flu pandemic, which makes me think they might have had to come there from Beaumont, because I don't know that Kuntz was particularly ravaged by the epidemic, but it could have been. It's one of those things I've just got to research if I ever get the time.
Well, thank you so much, Judy, for sharing all this information with us today. It was very, very interesting. We will be making a donation in your name to the Rotary Foundation. And you mentioned it at the first, that something similar in our lifetimes that we might could somehow compare some of the feelings about it to was End Polio Now. So we'll be making a donation to End Polio Now in your name. And thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I hope you were able to hear it.
We were. And also, this, when you have technical difficulties like we did today, it just shows that every Rotarian is so important, because we have, thank you to all of you in here that had some technical experience that were able to coach us through this to make this happen today. Rotary is just a beautiful place. Our next speaker is going to be on the Museum of the Gulf Coast, and it's going to be presented by the museum's executive director, Tom Neal. So you'll want to join us for that. In closing, I want to thank you all for attending the meeting today, and let's end with the four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. First, is it the truth?
Is it the truth?
Second, is it fair?
Is it fair to all concerned?
Third, will it build goodwill and
better friendships?
And fourth, will it
Be beneficial to all concerned.
Have a good week and go out and find opportunities to lead and serve. Ding.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye. Y'all have a good day.